We were on a field exercise, practicing offensive and defensive actions. 3rd Platoon was entrenched at the edge of the woods, and we were to attack. The 2nd Platoon commander with his protruding belly looked ridiculous in his tight uniform. He was hastily giving his last instructions. "Imagine you are on the front line," he said, "and you are being showered with a hail of bullets. So behave accordingly." What did we know about the front line? We knew we'd be given medals and the enemy would surrender in droves. Our boys took Poland and then France. They fought damn well at the front. There was not a shadow of fear in their eyes, and there was always a great goal ahead. What they accomplished was within our grasp too. Did that mean we were upstarts? Of course not. We were not cowards. If we had been at the front, we would have received the Iron Cross and praise from a country proud of us, as well as promotion, for bravery in the face of enemy fire. If that had happened, a bloke like Roboy would have hanged himself, and him, and the company petty officer, and the whole damned bunch of them. Apparently, war with the Soviet Union was looming, which meant that we would at least see the beginning of hostilities. Our machine guns rang out merrily. We moved swiftly forward. We were now real soldiers, proud to be in the army. A wave of enthusiasm swept over us. One of the soldiers suddenly shouted hurrah, and then another, and soon we were all shouting like crazy. Let snipers shoot somewhere. Let mortar shells burst around us. What does it matter? Any fool knows that losses can't be avoided. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. But we were going to fight until we won. Besides, if one of us gets hit by a bullet, he dies a hero's death. So hooray, let's go, let's attack. Sam's Tio. It's out of action for shoe inspection. How many shoe checks are there? Rifle checks, mess kit checks, nightstand checks. There was no end to them. And one of us always got it. Either he got a kitchen order or overtime, or lost his leave. Most of the time it was red-haired Willie. No matter how hard he tried, he always found himself at fault when he put his possessions out for inspection. The commander would immediately find something to criticize and reprimand him for. The other recruit who was always getting into trouble was Mole, a small schoolteacher. Army drill was gradually breaking his psyche. Willie said the lad was melancholic by nature and often talked. We lined up our boots. It took us 2 hours to polish them to a shine. The petty officer barely glanced at the shining leather, and it seemed that everybody was all right. We were just about to breathe a sigh of relief when we heard the command, "No gymnacity off." We were not at all prepared for that, and I got a telling off too. I was not wearing braces. I couldn't stand those damned cuffs. Then I saw the petty officer giving the teacher a fright. A loose button was enough to draw attention to him, so he yelled at him. Mole, standing at attention and trembling with fear, swallowed the insults. The foreman continued to yell, and Mole shrank before his eyes. The bully would never dare to give someone else such a headbutt. He wouldn't have chosen Sheik, for example, because the latter took this kind of thing with an icy calm, and the petty officer could see that. But in the case of the teacher, he felt that every word hurt him like a whip, and so he took him in his stride. We all felt sorry for Mole. Ekeze. The military training continued, intensive training, endless, tedious mushtra. Willie visited us as often as he could. He felt a great need of our company. He did not feel defenseless with us. The barracks filled him with fear, the fear that Meyer and his kind had caused him. And he was afraid of many others. Franzel shook his imposing fists menacingly and grumbled something about what he would do to that scoundrel Meyer if he got his hands on him. One day, during the morning inspection, the company commander announced that someone who knew English was needed as an interpreter for a special assignment. Someone who had sufficient language skills could make himself known. I teed loudly, excitedly. "Yeah." We turned around. It was Teacher Mole. He rose up on his toes, waving his glasses in the air, hopefully, and a blush appeared on his cheeks from excitement. "Wickenpanid said die?" The petty officer asked. "Metin Private Mole, Mr. Petty Officer." The nagging petty officer raised his head. "No kidding. Are you the only one here?" he asked mockingly. "A half-wit soldier like you. You'll embarrass the whole company. You're so inept you won't last 3 days. Besides, we need a man fit for service in the tropics, and I don't see how you can fit." Mole was shocked. He slowly put his glasses on his nose. He must have been very nearsighted. That day, close to evening, a bullet had pierced his head during training firing. He died on the spot, his glasses dangling from one ear. Blood dripped on the glass. As a company commander regarded it as a regrettable accident. The non-commissioned officer who had conducted the firing exercise would be punished for negligence. Meyer was in charge, Mole fired twice, and both shots went above the target. Meyer gave vent to his abuse and promised Mole a special lesson. There was a long pause during which the teacher looked Meyer straight in the eye and, before he could stop him, pointed the gun at himself. Franzel was out of his mind. "Oh, the son of a bitch should be beaten to death," he said in a rage. "It must have been the drill," I said, "the inhuman strain of military training." "Maybe it's Mole's character," said Willie, to our great amazement. "I told you he was a melancholy sort of fellow. Sooner or later he would have done it anyway, even without the barracks and without a cattle like Meyer." A few days later Meyer was transferred to a combat regiment, a motorized unit, and it was officially announced to us that he had volunteered for the front. We had a new front. We were at war with the Soviet Union. Emma's ditto. There was an order from the High Command to speed up our training. We needed replenishment of personnel for the Eastern Front. We were told to be ready for a forced 2-day march to a training centre 86 kilometres away. In full parade, in full dress, and with everything else, we set off. The regimental orchestra marched ahead of us, blaring brass trumpets. The small town began to praise our heroism in advance. Then we sang. We had learnt the newfangled war songs without enthusiasm, but now we were singing them with all the strength of our lungs. After about 2 kilometres, the band turned back into town. With it, all our self-confidence and pride vanished. The charms were gone. All that was left was a crowd of unhappy recruits who had to march 90 kilometres in 2 days. "It wasn't that bad," Franzel said, undoing the buttons of his collar. "For us it was like a day of field exercise. Discipline was relaxed. We were allowed to talk on the move, unbutton our collars and take our rifles on our belts or hang them on our shoulders as we liked. Behind us someone was telling racy anecdotes. We listened and laughed too. Bill told a couple of jokes himself. Every time he got to the salt of the story, he would lunge forward so that his hooked nose would loom over our shoulders to make sure we didn't miss any of the witticisms. I thought of Willie, who, as usual, would blush profusely and then say it was from the sun. After 3 hours, the scorching sun was no longer to our liking at all. Our uniforms were soaked with sweat, our tongues stuck to our palates, our rifles rubbed on our shoulders, and all talk became silent. We moved with difficulty further and further, hour after hour, left, right. Our eyes saw nothing but the dusty heels of the boots of those ahead. Many more hours passed before we reached the destination of the first day. There was a terrible heat. Soon some began to drop out of formation, having received sunstroke. Orderlies would run up and put smelling salts to their noses, and as soon as the victims regained consciousness, they had to continue marching again. No one was to lag behind. That was the order. Towards dusk, we were finally allowed to make a halt in the hangars of the airfield. Almost no one had an appetite. We only wanted to sleep. The next day, people were dropping like flies. Peasant women put out buckets of water along the road. We pounced on them like a pack of dogs, wetting handkerchiefs and tying them round our necks. Soon we had to ask the women to pour water on us. We kept walking and walking. Our feet were covered with blisters, some of us limping badly. I could hardly drag myself. But it was not the blisters that killed me. I must have sprained my right leg. I was completely exhausted and could no longer walk. Without a word, Franzel took my duffel bag and Willie carried my rifle. Lieutenant Straub came up. "What's the matter? You're not going to fall off completely, are you? You'll be all right, won't you?" "I think so, Lieutenant," I replied, hobbling and dragging my injured leg. At last we arrived, and then I collapsed in exhaustion. When I came to, I was lying on a bunk with Franzel and Pill lying beside me. I pulled off my boots. There was a green-brown spot on the instep of my foot, but it was as if there was no swelling. Franzel hefted me on his back and carried me to the regimental doctor. Half the battalion was already there. The young medic touched the spot. "It looks like a classic metatarsal fracture," he said with doubt in his voice. "How could this have happened?" It wasn't easy being separated from the others. We wanted to be together when we were sent to the front, and now I had to go to hospital. But Pill comforted. "Don't worry, old Benno, we'll keep your place." Franzel distracted me, filling most of my time. "God knows what's in store for us," he said. Ete. Dozens of soldiers from our battalion were lying in the hospital. Our forced march continued to be the main topic of conversation. Some thought it was undertaken to toughen us up for the advance into Russia, but others believed that the whole operation would be completed in 2 or 3 months. When someone said it would take a whole year, we laughed in his face. Now, Serge, how long did it take us to conquer Poland or France? There was no doubt that we would defeat the Russians. Even the most hardened pessimists did not expect defeat at all. Every now and then the radio was solemnly announcing the brilliant victories that followed one after another. The Reds were retreating indiscriminately. At every mention of our victorious armies I was bursting with pride. However, we did not have to wait long for the first disappointment. An ambulance train arrived, the first from Russia, and the orderlies began to bring out soldiers with severed limbs, in blood-spattered uniforms, with blood-soaked bandages on their legs, arms, heads and chests. We also saw pale, twisted faces with sunken eyes. One of those wounded in Russia, a swarthy, thick-necked chap, told us what it was like. According to him, it was very frightening. The Reds fought desperately, and we suffered heavy losses. The rapid advance continued, but at a cost that we could hardly pay for a long time. To top it all off, the Russians had a disproportionate number of soldiers under arms. NID. I spent 6 uneventful weeks in the hospital. During that time, the fracture healed, and I was discharged to join my company, where the boys were worried about whether I could catch up with them. Eventually, I made it to the barracks where my platoon was stationed. I opened the door and piled into the anthill where people were swarming everywhere. They were packing. Sheik was the first to see me. His eyes narrowed in great amazement. Then he waved his chubby hands, snapping his fingers like castanets. "Oh, by my sore back," he shouted. "Is it really you, Benno? Come to me, light of my eyes." I was instantly surrounded. Franzel shook my hand until it ached, and the lanky Pill nearly broke my back when he clapped me on the shoulder. Willie's eyes shone as he looked at me through the panes of his glasses. He seemed even more fragile than before. Pill laughed. "Listen, old man," he said. "We were just talking about you. You're just in time. Have you seen the marching orders? We're setting off tonight." Franzel suggested, "See if you can with us. It would be great if we could all get together." We had a new company commander, a captain with whiskers touched with grey. He gave me a choice, to go through another military training or to go straight to the front with the others. "I'd like to know," he said, "do you really think you're done with it? Do you really want to give up your sick leave? And what was I going to say? I wonder if you haven't got a false idea about this Russian campaign." I stared in amazement. The questions were direct, like commands, but there was something in his voice that seemed to carry a different meaning. He was a decent man, not a bastard like Meyer, stern but human. Did he think I was one of the fools eager to fight the enemy? No, whatever illusions we may have had at one time, the sergeants in camp beat them out of us. We just promised each other we'd stick together, that's all. "They beg of you, Asitas?" shouted the captain. "Can't you make up your mind?" I could have told him a lot of things, but I only said that I wanted to go with the others. I had thought it over, and then I thanked him and left. We left the same evening at 7 o'clock. A passenger train brought us to a small town filled with troops ready for departure. In a long column we marched to the railway junction where an endless train of freight wagons awaited. The huge concrete railway station was filled with grey-field uniforms, satchels and rifles. Howitzers were loaded into the front wagons. Several field kitchens followed, and anti-aircraft guns and double-barreled anti-aircraft machine guns were placed at regular intervals throughout the train to counter low-flying aircraft. At 10 o'clock the train was filled to the last corner, and about midnight, after 2 unsuccessful attempts, the unwieldy giant slowly moved. Where to? To the northern, southern or central section of the front? We didn't know. We weren't even sure if we were heading for Russia at all. Ashite. There were 40 of us in the carriage. Finally, we reached Breslau and entered Poland. Children and women surrounded our train, begging for bread. They spoke a foreign language, but their gestures were quite eloquent. We gave them something to eat. Back then, we could still share food. We crossed the Soviet border at Przemysl and saw the first effects of the bombing. The former Russian part of the locality was heavily destroyed. This was where the attack had started. We gazed at the destruction in silence, overwhelmed by the great mystery that this war carried with it. Hours of ruins. chimneys sticking out of the pile of stones, houses cut in half, revealing the hidden corners of each floor, metal grates broken like matches, shattered beams, ruined walls, utter chaos where once there had been normal life. The fruits of centuries of labour had been turned to ash in just a few hours. We kept driving past new ruins, broken trees and shell craters. Here and there we came across the first hit tanks, deadly monsters, now defeated by steel. The further we moved forward, the more often we came across broken vehicles. There, a tank bogged down in the swamp, another overturned like a dead beetle. Tanks with their giant tracks, torn by mines, tanks without turrets, decapitated. We became despondent and felt depressed. We turned our thoughts back to home and wished we knew what lay ahead. Everybody out. Line up in front of your carriages. We had been on the road for a fortnight and could hardly believe that the train had stopped for good. We gathered our things and jumped off the train, clumsily moving on stiff legs. We lined up, rifles stacked high, duffel bags in front of us. Company commanders were summoned to the unit commander's office. We were allowed to walk around, but we had to be in plain sight. Peel went to take a look at the nearest station. On the way, Willie grimaced and remarked, "No, so that's how far German trains go. This is our last link to home." The town was called Vinica, as the name was hastily scrawled in German under the Russian letters. The railway station was large, quite modern, and almost undamaged. The only bomb had torn off a piece of the roof and scratched the facade. All the windows, of course, had been blown out. A long train of open freight cars was waiting outside the station. Seeing some soldiers from another regiment wandering nearby, Sheik asked them who the transport was for. One of them turned round. "Are you blind?" he muttered irritably. "Look over there. There they go." Suddenly we saw a long, slowly winding, brown earth-coloured snake of people moving in our direction. There were muffled voices, like the buzzing of a swarm of bees. Prisoners of war. Russians, 6 in a row. We could not see the end of this column. As they came closer, the horrible stench that wafted over us made us nauseous. It was like combining the stench from cave lions with the bad odour from the monkeys in the zoo. But they weren't animals. They were people. We wanted to get away from the stink cloud encompassing us, but what we saw made us freeze in place and forget about the nausea. Were they really human beings? These grey-brown figures, these shadows, waddling towards us, stumbling and staggering, creatures who had nothing left, but the last shred of will to keep going. It seemed that all the misery in the world was centred here, and as if that were not enough, there was an eerie chorus of moans and screams, wails and curses mixed with the rough shouts of the guards. When one of the prisoners staggered out of the column, a crushing blow from a rifle butt between the shoulder blades brought him, panting, back to his place. Another, wounded in the head, ran a few paces forward, his gestures almost grotesque in their expressiveness, and asked one of the terrified natives for a piece of bread. A leather whip wrapped around his shoulders and threw him back into the ranks. A skinny, lanky fellow stepped aside to urinate, and when he too was forced back to his seat, he still continued to emit urine as he kept walking. Very few of them were wearing ordinary boots. Most had rags wrapped around their feet and secured with rope. How many kilometres had they walked? We gazed into faces that were more dead than alive. Often the eyes burned with such hatred that they seemed to sizzle themselves. But the next instant, by the strange manner of these men, they were all subdued, looking back anxiously at the guards and their whips cleaving the air. The forwards of this human mass had already reached the wagons and were loaded into them like cattle. One of them was so exhausted he couldn't climb in and fell backwards onto the road. A pistol shot sounded dryly, and, as if struck by lightning, the Russian bent down, blood trickling from his half-open lips. As the brute who had shot him passed us, Franzl leaped towards him. "I'll kill you, you brute," he shouted. "Who told you to kill that man?" But the man only stared at him, not understanding. Pull yourself together, boy," he said. "You're a recruit, I suppose. This ain't no kindergarten. They'll soon beat that baby talk out of you." We stood as if paralyzed. Franzl clenched his fists. "The bastard speaks German," he exploded. "He wears the same uniform as us." "We'll have to call such a scum a comrade from now on," said Pill grimly. "Ex as Vic." We were on the march. A few more kilometres, we were told. It was always the same. A few more kilometers. To kill time, we sang old marches or argued about God and the world. But we couldn't get those prisoners out of our heads. No matter what we talked about, we always came back to that subject. "Did you see any women in uniform?" someone asked. "There's a whole bunch of them in that line of men." It was a non-commissioned officer in his late teens, broad-shouldered and big-headed. He spoke in a heavy, low voice and nodded at every word, as if to emphasize it. We called him Kovak, though that was only the first half of his long, hard-to-pronounce surname. He had been here before, in the very early days of the campaign, and we enjoyed his society. "Their women are even more fanatical than the most egregious commissars," he continued, mincing his words. "The devil is in them." "You mean that they are handy with guns?" "You bet they are, lad. What did you think? They spend their spare time embroidering doilies." The sun was beating down, and we were drenched in sweat. Fortunately, we were only carrying our field packs. We were followed by a column of loaded wagons pulled by horses. They carried the rest of our belongings. Soon the first victims of scuffed feet appeared, waddling with difficulty, struggling to keep up with us. Then someone had the idea of waiting for one of the baggage carts and climbing on top of the load. The others followed suit. In 2 days' time, all the wagons were already full, and when one of them finally broke under the weight, all riding was strictly forbidden. Now the lame people moved on either side of the wagons, and only a few with special medical certificates continued to ride. We dragging our feet, further and further, day after day. We were so exhausted we could barely speak. We barely shaved in complete apathy, stopping our gaze on the heels of the person walking ahead. We hardly ever looked at the numerous Soviet tanks that had been hit. But when here and there we came across a defeated giant with a black swastika cross, or when we saw a German aeroplane shot down in a field, we began to glumly look at each other. These wrecks seemed to carry a warning. The Sheik was quite bad, slumping over on his feet like a lame duck. "Go to the doctor and get a certificate," I said. "What's the use? Look at these wagons, they're all full." Next morning there was no sign of him, or his rifle or satchel anywhere. When we finally located him, we couldn't believe our eyes. That sly son of a bitch was riding victoriously alone in a bloody cart. The animal was an old mare, practically 1 foot in the grave, but still managed to drag it along. He prowled around all night until he finally found a peasant who sold him the cart and horse. That must have been a good deal, I thought. The distance we covered in a day was shrinking drastically. There was hardly a man among us capable of walking properly, and there was no hint of how long it might last. Then our march stopped quite suddenly. We came upon an endless column of waiting lorries. We were travelling much faster now, the cool breeze whistling in our ears. Our faces, covered with a thick layer of dirt and dust, were unrecognizable. But morale quickly returned to normal, especially when we were given coffee and schnapps. As for us, we would have let this trip continue until the end of the world. But our pleasure was short-lived. We soon arrived. X-ray. The companies were divided. We were asked what we had done in civilian life, what training we had received, whether we had an engineering background. Kovak told us, "You have to tell them that you have a driving license. Then you'll get into a motorized infantry unit, maybe a supply column. That's the stuff, no more tedious walking." He seemed to be smiling on us. We needed drivers. Franzel was the only one, apart from me, who could practically pass the test. Pill-and Willie at least had some idea of driving, and Sheik, though he had once owned a motorbike, had never driven a... Having the nerve to tell the senior sergeant that he had every kind of driving license in existence. Let them check with his folks if they wanted to. The sergeant, of course, had somewhat different things to worry about and interrupted him by saying he needed another driver. The next day we were transferred to the transport unit. Kovak, the 5 of us, and 11 others. N.I. Sheik was my partner driver. We were given a wrecked old Opel, Franzel got a Ford, and he and Pill spent the day fixing it up. Willie was now in favour commander's personal chauffeur. We became the rear guard of the engineers, a very dusty job. Only bombers and low-flying aeroplanes disturbed us from time to time. True, there was talk of partisans. It was believed that they were masters of ambushing convoys. Driving as such was quite hard work. After the rain, the lorries were constantly sliding on the road, sometimes overturning. Our commander, Lieutenant Siebland, was not a bad guy. For example, he didn't mind us growing moustaches. The Sheik grew a beard. No one would have believed we were only 19. The meals were excellent. We had our own camp kitchen and a damn good cook from Hamburg. Whenever we found anything edible, we requisitioned it, and we could always count on Pill, who had a great appetite, to find something. One day he managed to requisition a piglet. Its infuriated owner, a wrinkled old woman, ran after him, demanding the return of her property in a language that was obviously full of foul language. The Sheik, a born diplomat, treated her to a bar of chocolate as consolation and shared some roast meat with her. After all, it was her piglet. NTT. Kovak was from Lower Silesia. He spoke fluent Polish and passable Russian, so Lieutenant Siebland appointed him as the cantonment officer. Kovak took these duties seriously and performed wonders in requisitioning the best beds and providing female company for those who wanted it. But the most marvellous bed loses its charm if bedbugs crawl all over it. I once tossed restlessly all night trying to get rid of the little bloodthirsty parasites. Kovak was inconsolable. He said it was ruining his reputation. He was consoling us as best he could when the Sheik suggested, "Why don't we give this fine bed to Worm, that worthless non-commissioned officer who gets greedy when distributing rations?" It was a brilliant idea. Sergeant Worm, an arrogant prig who was always chastising us, agreed to our proposal one day. He liked the posh apartment Kovak had arranged for him. When Worm got up the next morning, it was hard to recognize him. He looked as if he'd slept with his head in a beehive. At the end, we reached the Ukrainian city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. Kovak put us up in a very nice cabin with a pleasant elderly couple. We received a warm welcome and felt quite at home. Our hosts spoke German quite well. On the mantelpiece was a photograph of a young man in the uniform of a Soviet sailor. Yes, it was one of their 3 sons. The other 2 had been in the infantry, but nothing had been heard of them since the beginning of the war. Only then did we realize for the first time that this whole war was utter madness. These old men were treating us as if we were their own sons, and in return for their hospitality we might have to shoot their boys, trying our best to kill them. We had planned to go to the cinema, but the town was filled with troops and the cinema was packed to capacity. We decided to have fun on the go. Kovak was in good form and told obscene jokes. The Sheik talked to every girl he could find, but only as much as he could. Willie kept talking about his relatives and was homesick. Soon evening came and the stars appeared. We slowly made our way towards the house. From afar we could see some feverish activity in the air. Then the aeroplanes drew closer, and we could see their red and green navigation lights. Franzel shook his head. "Yes, flying around like it was peacetime," he muttered. There were 3 planes in all. Suddenly Kovak looked up anxiously. "No, those aren't ours. It's the Russians." "You're not joking, are you? Why do they have lights?" Camouflage, I guess." And as if to prove his point, all hell broke loose. We were sprawled on the ground. Then more bombs were dropped, but this time away from us. The house closest to us took a direct hit. Smoke was rising from the wreckage. 200 meters away from us, a bomb exploded in the street and hit 3 regular soldiers. 2 of them were unrecognizable. They had just been human beings like ourselves. Now they were a shapeless mass. The 3rd had his right leg torn off. He was a young lad, moaning weakly in a pool of blood that was rapidly increasing. Kovak ran up to give him first aid. Kovak, to his credit, had taken medical courses. The boy, who was unconscious, was then sent to the hospital. Air raids were now a regular occurrence. We were picked up several times that night. The next day, our unit suffered its first casualties. The commander told us to bring the camouflaged lorries to order. As it happened, we lined up behind them. I counted 16 bombers flying in links. The forward planes dropped a series of bombs each. I shouted to Franzel to hide and jumped into a roadside ditch. The Sheik followed me. The ground shook and I thought my eardrums were going to burst. Our truck was engulfed in flames. Another had lost its awning. The kitchen truck. 2 soldiers were crouched nearby. One of them was our cook from Hamburg. You would have thought he was still alive. Only a thin splinter was sticking out of his jaw. At first I did not recognize the other. He had his face in the ground. Then I saw that it was Worm, a non-commissioned officer. The back of his head was a bloody mess. Not far away, we dug 2 trenches. Siebland said a few words about the fate of the soldier and the fatherland. It was evident that these words meant nothing to him. He just spoke pro forma, and the two bodies were wrapped up and buried in the ground. End. The easy life was over. That same night, it got colder. Driving was a harsh experience, especially because we were on the road day and night. Twice we had skirmishes with partisans. We got through it all right, but it was safer now to carry machine guns instead of carbines. We were ordered to go by 2 lorries to Zaporozhye with rubber inflatable boats and bomb disposal equipment. I was called by the commander and I asked that Franzel with his Ford go with me. Sheik and Pil came with me as shift drivers. On the way back, just before dark, Franzel's Ford broke down. I went with the Sheik to look for a place to sleep. We soon came upon a peasant's house. As it was located off the road, we stopped the truck and walked to the house, leaving our weapons in the car. The entrance was behind us. There seemed to be no one in the house. All we saw was a dying cow on a pile of manure, roaring while looking up to the heavens. "Oh, that damn cow is getting on my nerves," said the Sheik. "I'm going to get a gun and finish her off." I objected at once. "Stay where you are. We'll decide what to do with her later. See the old woman in the window?" At that moment, the face disappeared. We tried to enter the house, but the doors were locked. The Sheik knocked on the window. Hey, dearie," he shouted. "Open up." Suddenly the door was opened, but it was not the old woman who came out. 2 men came out. They were followed by others, 7 in all. Quite suspicious-looking lodgers. Dirty, unshaven, dishevelled in windbreakers. Partisans? The Sheik's jaw dropped. "Oh, my aching back," he muttered. "Where did they come from?" They surrounded us at once. "A cigarette," said one of them. It was nothing unusual that they wanted cigarettes. All Russians asked for them. The only thing that was alarming was the threatening tone of his voice. The Sheik gave me a meaningful glance and pulled out a packet of cigarettes. Clearly these men were guerrillas, though apparently unarmed. There was no doubt that they had noticed that we had no weapons either. A bloody, ticklish situation. The Sheik smiled, pretending not to expect anything bad, and held out his packet of cigarettes. He had intended to buy time until the others came up. Franzel and Pil were, of course, nearby, but the Russian didn't just take one cigarette. He took the whole packet. The Sheik laughed as if this amused him greatly, and said to me, "Hey, a kick in the stomach and back to the lorry." Noting his tone, you would have thought it was a joking request to return the cigarettes. But the Russian swore harshly, stepped forward and tried to put his hand in my pocket. I turned round to prevent this. Then he grabbed me by my overcoat. Everything else happened lightning fast. The Sheik threw away all pretense. He turned round sharply and shouted, "Look over there, back." One of the guerrillas was running towards our truck. God Almighty, what if he took our machine guns? The men surrounding us were talking rapidly among themselves. One of them bent down, picked up a weighty club and brought it down on Sheik's shoulders. The Sheik lurched forward, and I received a blow in the face that nearly blew my head off my shoulders. Then they all pounced on us. Now, a 6.35mm Mauser is a beautiful thing. It looks sleek and harmless and is easy to conceal in the hand. I acquired one of these pistols only a few days ago from one of the regular soldiers and always carried it with me in my overcoat pocket. The Sheik had no idea what my trump card was. When he took out his cigarettes, my hand was already in my pocket, trying to take the little pistol off the safety, which was not easy to do because it jammed from time to time. However, at the last moment I managed to do it. Then I snatched up the miniature weapon and pressed the trigger 4 times. One of the guerrillas, bent over, collapsed on top of me. Another was wounded in the arm and howled in pain, and the others began to withdraw, seeking cover in a nearby grove. I tried to hit them on the run. The Sheik rose to his feet. "Oh, my poor skull," he roared. "Damned bastards." That's when I remembered the quick guy who ran towards our truck. I had one more round left in me, so I dashed after him. But at the same moment a whole series of shots rang out, with the characteristic sound of a German machine gun's cue. But at whom was this Russian shooting? New shots. And then it became clear to me that it was not our lorry that was firing. It was Franzel. An old Ford was rumbling towards us, and Franzel was riding in it with an automatic pistol at the ready. He was shooting at my Opel. The Russian who got to him was trying to get away. Franzel jumped out of the car, took careful aim, and fired a full magazine at him. The Russian fell to the ground. I ran up to him. He was dead. Franzel came up beside me. "Listen," he shouted. We were close to death. "Where's old Sheik?" Hey, behind the house. He's had a bit of a beating, but I reckon he'll be all right. Phil came in with a new clip. Franzel reloaded his gun and slung it on his shoulder. It won't take us long to get the old fort started, he said. We were on our way when we heard gunfire. Was that you? Sure. I nodded. You know about my little 635mm pistol? Oh, first class. I should get one of those too. So when I heard those shots, I said to myself, something's brewing. Then I saw the bastard running towards your truck. Good thing he had that sheepskin on, or I'd have thought it was one of you. We searched the house but found only the old woman, who was now spewing curses. We discussed our next move. It was useless to pursue the partisans. It was already dark, and the neighborhood was full of hidden hiding places. So I suggested we should run away. That dying cow was still moaning outside, and Franzel finished her off. The young fellow who had been hit by my bullet lay curled up and moaned in unconsciousness. We bandaged him up and put him in the Opel. There's no point, said Fratzel. As a partisan, he would be shot anyway. We might as well shoot him here. But we knew that these were empty words. Who would do the job? None of us were eager to do it. Not. That evening we handed over our wounded prisoner to the commandant of the little town, a young lieutenant. We were treated to a first-class dinner and given comfortable quarters, so we slept all the next day. And E-Day. Our unit was split up. We had to hand over our lorries. I was sorry to part with my Opel. I was very used to it, but because of the severe cold weather, it was no longer a pleasure to drive. None of the gloves were warm enough to keep my fingers from getting stiff. My hands could hardly hold the steering wheel, and my feet were sore from the cold. 20 men were transferred to the Special Service Company. The 5 of us and Kovak and a few others from our battalion were among them. Lieutenant Seebland made a brief farewell speech and shook hands with us all. When he approached Sheik, he grinned and said, "A Satanti beard, isn't it?" The Sheik was so annoyed that he shaved it off the same night. The lieutenant's farewell to Willie, who was his personal chauffeur, was particularly warm. "Oh, don't be discouraged, my boy," he told him. "Even this performance will end one day." The lorry took us to Kremenchug. Our new commander was a small captain, a real pompous lowlife. He greeted us with a lecture on discipline and duty. Not a very promising start. However, he was like a dog that barks more than it bites, and one day we cracked him up. Captain Krebs was a braggart and a real bore of inspections and purges, but we soon learnt to get on with him. The petty officer was a man of venerable age, all glowing with complacency and joy and looking at the soldiers like a hen at her chickens. The non-commissioned officers were all good fellows, and we got along very well. But we were struck by the fact that all of them were already LVs. Most of them had families and children of great age. Like I said, old Krebs was no problem. We played along with his vanity and became his show company. Besides, thanks to his vanity, we had a pair of high-powered buses, a luxury that made other units green with envy. For his own use, Krebs requisitioned a magnificent vehicle which, despite the muddy Russian roads, had to gleam like a polished semaphore at all times. Despite his shortcomings, Krebs kept an eye on everything: food, allowances to the multifamily. Overnight, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero. We huddled together in our buses, baring our teeth from the cold. A new ammunition depot was set up in Stalino, and we had to guard it day and night. We entertained hopes that maybe we would be transferred to warm flats. But there was no heat, not even flats. We, with blue lips and shivering, were built one evening in front of a couple of sheds without windows or doors, not a hint of a stove. The last occupants must have been Russians, and they had certainly taken everything out of these premises. And these sheds were to be our shelter for the night, at 10 degrees below zero. "That'll be fun," said Franzel. The Sheik used all his rich store of swear words. Kovak and Franzel started boxing, just to keep warm. Since there was no choice, we started to settle in for the night. At least it was spacious. The only bat lantern gave a meagre light, but it was enough to highlight a wire stretched across the shed 1 metre above the floor. Without spotting it, we'd all fall head over heels. But we didn't bother to remove it. We just huddled together like a pile of dolls and tried to sleep. The frost was like a venomous reptile through our clothes and blankets, biting at our toes and fingers, creeping up our arms and thighs and down our backs. I decided that if I couldn't fall asleep within a quarter of an hour, I would go outside and run all night. Within a minute, however, there was a hellish explosion. In the first moment after the scare, I realized that I was still alive and the barn was still in place, but we had to hurriedly run out of it. That's what it was. The second shed was blown to pieces. It was gone. In its place is just a pile of planks and arms and legs, wriggling out from under them. But most of the boys got out of the wreckage on their own, although a few were injured, but only one seriously. So what had happened? There was a suspicious wire in their shed too. They highlighted it, but when one of the guys went out to get a torch, he forgot about the wire and caught his foot on it. The wire was connected to a landmine designed to destroy tanks. So the explosion was directional. Due to this circumstance, the men survived. The wire in our shed also turned out to be a trap. Now we carefully defused this mine. Then followed a scrupulous search with torches and matches for other booby traps. We were now expecting them behind every suspiciously protruding board or protruding nail. But we had a dirtier job ahead of us. The next morning, after a night that had been as cold as 1,000 deaths, so cold that even the tea froze in our thermoses, we found a smaller shed near the barracks, with a fine iron stove in it. Kovak instantly got some paper and a wood bulb for kindling, and was about to light it, when he noticed a strange metallic object inside, and, to our amazement and horror, he took a bomb out of it. Another one was in a rubbish bin. "It's the Russians' mine storehouse for their heavy mortars," Kovak said seriously. By now we were so alarmed that we suspected bombs behind every pile of rubbish. Pill was treading with his feet high up like an old rooster, just in case, quite a funny sight with his long thin legs, but now even the Sheik was laughing. Of course, there was nothing to laugh at. No one but the devil himself would feel at home here. We soon adapted the remaining barn for habitation, and in about a week made it quite comfortable. We managed to requisition 3 stoves and stoked them day and night. But the mercury column of the thermometer fell even lower. Sounding guard became torture, no matter how many things you wore. We looked like toy bears. 2 pairs of underpants, 2 pairs of trousers, 2 jumpers, soldiers' work clothes, field uniforms, and a thick fur coat, made especially for guard duty. Our hats had fur earmuffs. Only our eyes and nose were open. The prickly wind penetrated through the fabric covering the chin, and like 1,000 needles stabbed into the skin. Not a day went by without someone getting frostbite on their nose. We were on guard duty for 2 hours at a time, followed by 2 hours of warming up. At night we got 4 hours rest. "A hell of a system," said Kovak. "But what's it like for those poor fellows in the trenches?" We often heard a rumbling sound from the front line to the east of us. Once a Russian aeroplane flew over us with a roar, destroying everything with every means at their disposal. Accurate and underflying bomb blasts and bullets tearing up the snow everywhere. The small caliber cannons started talking. We lay in the snow neither alive nor dead because of all the explosions around us, but nothing happened. A few hours later, the sentries discovered something unusual, a field dipot of shells that looked more like bombs. They were shaped very much like tadpoles with a big head and a long, narrow tail. They were decent-sized superbombs, each in its own box. These peculiar missiles were the object of much closer attention on our part. There were fantastic rumours about their striking power, and the regular soldiers called their ground bombers Stuka by analogy with the German dive bomber. The tail contained the substance that propelled the rockets. But the startling fact was that one of these monsters was actually hit by a shell fired from a Russian cannon, but the rocket did not explode. The guard reported this to Captain Krebs. The next day an artilleryman came round to check the detonator. Afterwards he congratulated us on the fact that we had not gone straight to heaven. All the rockets had been put out of action by the extreme cold. For 4 days there was such a heavy snowstorm that when we went out to go on guard duty we could hardly make our way to the posts. The ammunition depots, scattered behind the ruins of the factory, turned into a giant snow hill. The outlines of the collapsed walls merged with the grey sky. It all looked foggy and ominous. Guard duty in such conditions is a constant war against time. You get in and do a couple of laps of your route, but half an hour later you start listening to your watch, wondering if it stopped. Willie was with me. He bent his head and shrank back in the gusts of wind. We stumped around in the snow, trying to warm our feet until we were all sore. I shouted to Willie, "Let's get closer to the wall. It's not blowing so hard there." I crept over to a place where I could keep an eye on the ammunition depot, and Willie followed closely behind me. As far as I could judge from his face, he looked like a teenager. Tell me," I asked, Was it your 20th birthday or your 19th? He had just celebrated a birthday. 19, he said. He was the youngest in our group. We wished him a happy birthday and were going to give him a present, but all we had were cigarettes and he didn't smoke. What's the latest writing from home? He received a very nice parcel from his mother for his birthday. Socks, handkerchiefs, mittens, and a pair of house slippers. It was all tied with a pink ribbon. There was a lot of teasing about that pink ribbon. From home. You won't be particularly interested in that. Just another letter from Mum. Come on, tell me about it. Why wouldn't I be interested? What does she say about your birthday? I blew into my mittens to warm my hands. Yes, she says she celebrated it at home with 2 of my aunts. They talked about me the whole time. They felt sorry for me. He looked discouraged. I leisurely cleared the snow from the barrel of my carbine. What else? Never hurry, never get in the way. She says I don't need to strive for the Iron Cross. She thinks it's all rubbish. My feet were icy cold. It's a shame. But we still didn't have fur boots. Here, behind the lines and at the front, things were turning out to be very different from what mothers at home had imagined. She also writes to me to stay away from women and not to do anything stupid. Willie rubbed his nose and smiled strangely. Little by little Willie became more sociable, and I could see that he was happy to pour out his soul to someone. Mother prays a lot for me. She says I should pray all the time too, but I don't pray much these days. You don't often get a moment to do it in all this current mess, do you? I thought, when was the last time I prayed myself? It must have been years ago. Willie gave me a friendly nudge to think that way. She also says I should stick with you guys, you and Franzel, and tell you to keep an eye on me. So that's not a bad thing, is it? I laughed towards the howling wind, but I wasn't having any fun at all. What could I do to keep this boy out of trouble? What are you going to do when the war is over? I'm going to teach. I'll get a degree in history, geography and German. My uncle will give me money for my studies. He lost his father a few years ago. Willie took off one mitten and took a handkerchief out of his pocket. Then suddenly he said to me, how long do you think this war will last? I strained my eyes, staring into the grey shroud before us. I thought I saw some movement there. Willie, I said quickly, look over there where the girder is. Do you see anything? Yes, I do. Somebody's crawling. I took the safety off my rifle, pulled my right hand out of the gauntlet, and sprang forward toward the moving target. A man, when he saw me, he jumped up and ran. Oh, halt, stay where you are. I shouted, stop. He ran as fast as he could. I shot him in the head. He went round and round, then he tripped and fell into a snowdrift. He got stuck in it, tried to get out, fell again, then jumped like a goat, still no forward momentum. I calmly took aim. The distance was not very great, though visibility was poor. There was no way I could miss. But Willie had his hand on the rifle. Don't shoot, he asked. I lowered the barrel in utter amazement. What's the matter with you? He looked like a worried bird. Maybe he'll give up. In any case, he won't be able to get away. Rather irritably, I ran towards the snowdrift, Willie following me. But by this time the man had got out on solid ground. He ran back, followed along the fence, and fell right into the hands of the next sentry. Suddenly a shot rang out and the fugitive fell. He died 3 hours later in our barn, without regaining consciousness. From the papers he had on him, Captain Krebs had Kovak translate them. It was clear that the man was a scout. Willie was very upset about what had happened. I tried to argue with him. Look, Willie, if this man had left unharmed, it could have cost many lives of our soldiers at the front. Willie nodded. At least he knew what I meant. But I was sure that, regardless, the guy would try to stop me from firing if anything like that happened again. Et. Now we moved on eastwards in our buses, with a feeling of great relief that the other unit had been handed over this damned guard duty. But we were wishful thinking. An important supply base was waiting for new guards. The special unit to which we were attached had immediately given orders to arrive at the Russian prisoner of war camp, before morning to pick up from there batches of forced labourers for loading and unloading work at the supply base. When we were the first to enter the camp, we could hardly catch our breath. Behind a 3-metre high metal lattice fence with watchtowers, Machine guns and searchlights spaced at regular intervals were thousands of Russians housed in squalid barracks. Each individual barrack was surrounded by barbed wire. The whole structure resembled a bear pit, and this impression was reinforced by the huge bloodthirsty dogs kept on short leashes by the guards. A vile, sickening odour emanated from the whole place. It was already familiar to us from the first time we had encountered a column of prisoners of war who were being driven to be loaded onto freight wagons. One of the camp guards opened the door to the barracks and shouted something. The prisoners rushed outside, piling on top of each other. The sharp words of the command lined them up in 3 columns in front of us. The German-speaking headman, appointed by the guard, tried his best to bring order to the ranks with unusual rudeness. The camp guard selected 50 men and drove the rest back into the barracks. Some tried to slip into the working party, but those of the Russians who had already been selected for work drove off their rivals by shouting to the barrack headman. The latter gave vent to his anger against the guilty, striking the whip right and left, shouting and cursing, without a shadow of pity for his compatriots. Eventually the guard grew tired of all this, and he loosened the leash of his tearing dog. With one leap the dog made his way into the thick of the dump, and the next moment we saw him sink his teeth into the headman's hand. The camp guard looked on with perfect indifference. He did not think of driving the dog away. Meanwhile, the headman of the barracks tried desperately to shake off the animal. He looked pleadingly at the camp guard. When one of the beaten Russians tried to run back to the barracks, the dog let go of the headman's hand, dashed after the man and sank its teeth into his buttocks. The new victim screamed, but in a last desperate effort he managed to reach the door of the barracks, leaving shreds of his trousers and underpants in the dog's teeth. I have never seen a more disconsolate animal in my life. The camp guard burst into a deafening laughter. We heard his coarse cackling even as we went outside and trotted off with our 50 living skeletons. When we left this horrible place, we breathed a sigh of relief. Our prisoners were staggering about like drunks. Many of them didn't even have overcoats. Their uniforms hung in rags. They carried all their possessions with them. Empty tin cans of tinned meat and crumpled iron spoons. Only a few had a small bundle behind their backs, apparently with spare windings or a crumpled water flask, which they dared not carry openly for fear of arousing the envy of the others. The supply base was a small flat plot of land, enclosed by a fence, behind which were a number of wind-blown sheds. It was divided into 3 sections: an ammunition depot, a fuel depot, and a food depot. Every now and then lorries came and went, and the job of the prisoners was to load and unload them. We, the guards, were not supposed to help in this, but very soon we too began to work hard. It was a lot of work. Besides, we were not so cold while we were working. The Russians were very weak. They could hardly stand on their feet, let alone exert the physical effort required of them. 4 of them could hardly lift a crate, which was child's play for Franzel, but they were certainly trying their best. Each was eager to please. They competed with each other, pushing each other. Then they'd look to see if we'd noticed their diligence. In this way they hoped to be treated better, and perhaps to get a scrap of bread. We felt sorry for the wretches. There were almost children among them, and bearded old men who would have been old enough to be our grandfathers. All of them, without exception, begged for food or a cigarette. They whimpered and cowered before us like beaten dogs, and if pity and disgust became unbearable and we gave them something, they would crawl on their knees and kiss our hands and mumble words of gratitude, which must have been rich in their vocabulary, and we just stood there like statues. We could not believe our eyes. These were human beings who had nothing human left in them. They were human beings who had really turned into animals. We were sickened. We were utterly disgusted by it. But did we have the right to judge when we ourselves had never been forced to trade our last vestiges of pride for a piece of bread? We shared our supplies with them. It was strictly forbidden to give food to prisoners, but the hell with it. What we gave them was a drop in the ocean. Almost daily, people died of exhaustion. The survivors, indifferent to all these deaths, took their dead by cart to the camp to bury them there. Probably more prisoners were buried in the ground than there were alive. One day, behind an ammunition box, we found 3 dead Russians with blue faces. They had frozen to death. For some reason they had not had time to join those going back to the camp, and they were recorded as having escaped. Yes, there were runaways, but very, very few. It was quite tempting to sneak away while working outside the camp, but not often was there a person who took advantage of the opportunity. In such a situation, any of us would have jumped at the slightest chance to escape. But the Russians were a different sort of people. There was a great variety of stray dogs, among them the most unusual kinds of mongrels. The only thing they had in common was that they were all incredibly skinny. This did not matter to the prisoners. They were hungry, so why not eat fried dog meat, constantly trying to catch the wary animals. They also asked us to gesture, imitating barking woof woof and shooting piff paff to kill a dog for them. Just go ahead and shoot it. And we almost always did. It was a kind of sport for us, and besides, these wild dogs were breeding in great numbers. When we threw the shot dog to them, it was a sickening scene. Screaming like mad, the Russians would pounce on the dog and tear it to pieces with their hands, even if it was still alive. They stuffed the entrails into their pockets, a sort of inviolable reserve. There were always fights to get the biggest piece. The burnt meat smelled awful. There was hardly any fat in it. But they didn't fry dogs every day. Behind the barracks was a big stinking heap of rubbish, and if we weren't around, they would dig through it and eat. For example, rotten onions that would make you sick. Once, while loading food, a couple of vodka bottles broke, and the alcohol leaked onto the floor of the lorry. The Russians climbed on top of it and licked up the liquid like cats. On the way back to camp, 3 of them collapsed dead drunk. That's when Franzel got mad. He suddenly started beating one of these poor men with the butt of his gun like a madman, and the man's pitiful whimpering only made Franzel furious. He roared with rage like a huge wild cat and struck mercilessly until I sprang at him and grabbed him by the shoulder. "God Almighty, Franzel," I shouted. "What's got into you? Pull yourself together. Leave the poor creatures alone. They'll die without your help." But he shook off my hand, roaring like a bull. "I can't take it any more. Don't look at me like that. I'll go mad. I'm going mad. Nothing but this damn suffering. Nothing but these creatures, these reptiles. Look how they crawl on the ground, hear how they whimper. They must be crushed once and for all. Vile creatures, simply exterminated." After this outburst, he gradually calmed down, and the abnormal gleam in his eyes faded. "Benno," he murmured, "you must understand. I just can't stand it any longer." On the way back, he was silent the whole way. That night when we went to bed, he said, "Since I'm very sorry, old man, for what happened. I want to volunteer for the front." In Est. We had a clothing inspection. All Special Forces soldiers had to line up and show their underwear. Captain Krebs did the inspection personally, but this time there was no nagging. There was a good reason for the inspection. We all had lice, and their numbers were increasing at a fantastic rate. The speed at which these parasites multiply must be a biological phenomenon. Every evening we settled down in front of the oil lamp and hunted for the uninvited little guests. We would look through every inch of clothing, from shirts to overcoats, and crush them mercilessly with our thumbnail until we heard a snap or shake them off into the blazing furnace. The petty officer ordered us to be ready. We were to be sent somewhere the next morning. The company was being reassigned again. Well, what about our laundry? We had just collected all our dirty laundry, and one of the local girls agreed to wash it. Who's going with the laundry? No volunteers. We drew lots. I lost. When I finally went, it was already dark. I knocked. No answer. I waited a while and knocked again, louder this time. Then I heard the bed creak. There was the sound of shuffling bare feet. Then someone started lighting a match. The door opened, and I saw a woman standing behind it, wrapped in a blanket, her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. "I'm here about the laundry," I said. She nodded as if she understood, said something in Russian, and gestured for me to come in. There was a lit candle on the table. The bed was crumpled. A cat jumped on the chair, arched its back and stared at me with sparkling green eyes. The laundry was done and perfectly ironed. While she was tying it into a knot with one hand and holding the blanket with the other, I put the loaf of bread I had brought with me on the table and added a few rubles to it. Some of them fell to the floor. I stooped to pick it up. She did the same, and we bumped heads. I laughed. She laughed, too. But the laughter stuck in my throat, because when she straightened up, she forgot to grab the blanket, and it fell. I saw her bare shoulders, her lush breasts, her firm thighs. The sharp smell of her hair was driving me crazy. I grabbed her hands as she slid them down to pick up the blanket. I squeezed her wrists so hard she shrieked. Her big eyes looked pleading, full of tears. She had a young face with high-set cheekbones and regular features. She whispered something in her language I had no idea what. "Let's go," I said, then almost shouty. "Let's go?" She smiled embarrassedly, but the fear in her eyes was gone. Then she nodded suddenly and, still smiling, repeated the word. "Let's go." Deep into the night, as I carried the laundry back to camp, I felt like I was after a 3-day binge. XA. Our next destination was a railway junction, the last station before the front line where the combat units resupplied personnel and supplies. There was something peaceful about this railway, even though the locomotives and wagons were Russian. It reminded us of home and a time of peace. But appearances were deceiving. We soon wished to be away from the place. The thing was the Russian bombardment continued round the clock, with no air raid warnings. There was no point in warnings, though, as not even an hour passed without the bombs rumbling. We soon became a bundle of nerves. We had to be alert all the time, and our eyes were straining to see the sky. There was the rumble of aeroplanes that we could not see, and we expected a hail of falling bombs and sighed freely, only when they did not fall too close. I had the opportunity to work as an operator at a small telephone exchange. The job in itself was quite a busy one, in constant intercourse with high-ranking officers. The voice soon takes on the harsh tones of a man accustomed to giving commands, and you soon find that you are treated with genuine respect. It is only when the other end of the line asks if I am Major Edelweiss or Captain Tannenbaum that you have to watch yourself lest you be mistaken for the wrong person. Of course, all surnames near the front were fictitious. Everything was disguised to the last detail. But these precautions against spies, as we soon became convinced, were justified. The hail of bombs did not cease for a single day. Usually no more than 3 aeroplanes would dive on us, but as soon as they left, a new formation would arrive to replace them. Of course, we were now protected by an anti-aircraft battery, but it always opened fire when the Russian planes were already far away. We suspected that the artillerymen were afraid to discover their positions. They didn't want to be bombed themselves, but their idiotic firing in between raids completely pissed us off. Only once did our fighter come in, and that was a clumsy little Italian. The Russians were not noted for their swiftness, but they could give trouble to this old wreck at any moment. Of course, it may well be that its pilot was not anxious to grapple with the Russians, but he suddenly found himself on the same track with them, and then he showed them all he was capable of. One of the Russian aeroplanes was enveloped in smoke and went down in flames, but when the Italian engaged the second Russian aeroplane, he received the same repulse as he had given before. Now it was already smoky and corkscrewed downwards. Finish. This was the end of our flying resources for the time being. All we had left were worthless anti-aircraft guns. I shared a room with Franzel. His bed was against the wall, opposite the window. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, I heard a familiar rumble. Before I could warn Franzel, all hell broke loose. The explosions were so loud that I put my head under the blanket and covered my ears with my hands. Our window flew out with a monstrous crack. The doors were torn out and lifted into the air, and great chunks of the ceiling flew down. I jumped out of bed, wobbly. Frazel was still lying there, slumped against the wall. Then I heard him swearing in his usual manner. Thank God he was alive. Buzzing with my handheld generator lantern, I shone my light. There was a hole in the wall above him the size of a child's head. Franzel turned to me white as a sheet. Straight down his dishevelled hair was a straight furrow made by a bomb fragment that had shaved off the hair in that spot, leaving a red streak across his bare scalp. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands on his head. "My God," he said, "I'm so scared." I quite believed it. At 1. 2 nights later we were suddenly roused from our beds. The line-up at the station. We had to unload the ammunition train as quickly as possible. A long column of lorries stood ready. All our special unit, regardless of rank, was connected to this work. Although it was below zero on the thermometer, we were all soaked. We carried ammunition like lunatics. We hardly spoke a word. If the Russians had caught us at that moment, God save our souls. We prowled around looking for cover for that eventuality. Kovak found a concrete dugout big enough to shelter us. The shells were already making our legs shake. We were scurrying back and forth, from train to lorry, from lorry to train, with Captain Krebs bustling around, making sure there were no stops, giving instructions, swearing. He was the only one who didn't lift a finger himself. Then suddenly the Russians appeared. We could hear overhead the hum of aeroplanes scoping out a target. At the far end of the city we could see flashes of fire, followed by 2 explosions. The hum subsided, and we again continued to work like slaves, and one by one the cars with the load were sent towards the front. An hour later the enemy planes returned, dropping new bombs on the other side of the city. "What the hell do they want?" Pilly asked worriedly. Shut your mouth. They'll track us down pretty soon." We were getting more and more nervous. The Russians kept circling overhead. Within minutes our nerves were stretched to the limit. Would they really spot us? Then suddenly, quite close, we saw 2 red flashes. Flares launched in such a way that they crossed diagonally over our heads. More lights were coming down on the other side. The still unloaded cars were just between them. "Franz, scoundrels," he shouted. "They must have spies here." Quickly take cover," Kovak shouted. "A curtain of fire will spring up at any moment." We ran to the shelter, did not find it at once in the darkness, panicked, and only then finally squeezed our way down. But nothing happened. The aeroplanes kept circling. There seemed to be more of them. And then the real hell began. Earth-shaking explosions, the clang of flying metal, the nerve-wracking sound of splintering logs. We huddled together and tilted our heads. The anti-aircraft guns started talking. Through the rumble of exploding bombs, we caught the sound of barrage fire of anti-aircraft guns high in the sky. A foul odour of burning hit our noses. The whole area was on fire. Some bombers were now flying quite low, their propellers whirring like sirens. The next explosion shook the very ground beneath our feet. Ammunition. Metal shards whistled over our heads. Beams and fragments of masonry flew around us. The ground around us seemed to split open. When at last there was a temporary lull, we looked up. The railway station had collapsed like a house of cards. The whole neighbourhood was in solid smoke and fire. The ammunition train had been blown to pieces. In place of the fuel depot was now a gigantic crater. Then the whole performance was repeated again. The deafening thud of the bombers was drowned out by the rumble of explosions, and a new wave of attacking aircraft razed to the ground everything that had escaped destruction in the first raid. When it was finally over, we crawled out of our hiding place. There was a crushing pain in my ears. Where were the others? One by one, they crawled out of their hiding places. But many were missing. We searched. We found many wounded and dead. Then we came upon a crater big enough to hold 12 men. It was a mass of bloody clothes and torn human bodies. Some were still moaning. It was so horrible that I felt nauseous. So this was the true face of war. The company lost 19 men killed, and more were badly wounded that night. NDT. Captain Krebs was depressed. He wanted to give us in his manner jerky and rude orders, but could only give out of himself by gnashing his teeth. It seemed as if he had fallen in spirit. My spirits were heavy, as were everyone else's. But Krebs was so shattered that the mere sight of him put me out of the mood. Somehow the tortured tone of his voice gave me confidence. All in all, the damned life we were leading was beginning to bore me. I had to get rid of it. It was hardly worse at the front. There, at least, you could fight back. When you kill others, perhaps it dulls the fear of being killed. I had already discussed with Franzel the idea of asking for a transfer to the front. Now we were all ready to make such a request together, Pilly, Sheik, Willie and I. When Kovak said he would go with us, we hugged him with joy. In any case, it was not at all difficult to take such a decision. There were orders to move young soldiers to the front. We were looking for new flats. Meanwhile, I continued to fulfill my duties at the telephone exchange. 2 days later, 2 bombs fell on the street right next to the junction. I instinctively threw myself to the floor. The window pane flew over my head, and the entire window frame came crashing down on my back. Cracks went down the massive commode. I crawled out of the rubble into the street. 2 horses lay beside the overturned wagon. One of the animals was dead. The other let out a shrill cry as only a dying horse can. In the neighbourhood lay a Ukrainian in the last agony of death. He was cut from belly to chin. His bent arms held up his jerking entrails, as if he wanted to shove them back in. His breathing was ragged and bloody foam protruded from his teeth. His eyes were wide open, running from side to side, incessantly, as if he were following a clockwork pendulum. Franzel exploded when he saw the drunken Russian pals. Now it was my turn to snap. We were ready to shoot, slowly but surely, one by one. To hell with it if we had to die. At any rate, we wanted to go to war. Yes, we would go to the front and fight for our lives. Maybe by becoming killers ourselves. We won't let ourselves be killed. NIT. I came to report to Captain Krebs. Oh, it's you, he said. I was just about to send for you. Your request has been granted. You'll be transferred to an active unit tomorrow, you and the others.